special guest, Geoff Lee. Geoff, thank you very much for joining me. For those who don't know you, I wonder if you could say a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Sure. Yeah, first of all, it's just a pleasure to be here. Thanks for inviting me. I am a professor at the University of California, Berkeley, in philosophy. And my speciality is philosophy of mind, and particularly consciousness. So it's no coincidence that Richard invited me to be on this show. My current work is that I've been working on a book about consciousness, which I think we'll be talking about today.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, I got a sneak peek at this book, and I have to say it's excellent. I really enjoyed it. It's a really great work of philosophy. I like the whole sort of approach that you take in it. I mean, it's challenging but thorough and very thought-provoking. The whole project is sort of motivated by exploring materialist theories of consciousness, taking them seriously and sort of seeing where they run aground, or what strangeness they result in and where they don't result in strangeness. So now, is that because you think materialism is true, or are you just interested in the question, or how do you situate this with respect to, say, non-physicalist theories of consciousness?
I mean, I think it's foolish to have like very high credence in any of the main kind of metaphysics of mind because we're in pretty speculative territory. But yeah, I guess I have highest credence in materialist type views, and kind of, yeah, as you just said, the main point of the project was to kind of explore materialist views both from a kind of defensive point of view. So I'm kind of an optimist about the prospects of a kind of materialist explanatory theory of consciousness, but there's also a kind of pessimistic side. I think materialism has some really weird features that maybe haven't been fully appreciated. And in a way, I think materialists sort of overestimate the significance of consciousness if materialism is true. It seems like consciousness is this kind of deep divide in the universe that is highly morally significant and so on. And I think that if materialism is true, we might have to revise those types of beliefs. So although we can have a materialist theory of consciousness, in some ways that undermines the significance of what we were talking about in the first place.
Yeah, so that's your deflationary pluralism that we're going to start talking about at some point later, I think. But what would you say about someone who said that, I know you don't like it when people Tollens your ponens, but what would you say if someone said, well, look, if this is where materialism leads, and that's good evidence against it?
Well, so I think with any of these views, like in the end, we have to just look at the cost, and in the end, you're just doing a kind of cost-benefit analysis. I do think that all of the views of consciousness have strange features. So merely pointing out that materialism has some counterintuitive consequences is not enough. You have to like compare them with the counterintuitive consequences of other views. I tend to think that a big cost of some of the other views is that their initial motivations often can't in the end be sustained. So dualist views, for example, often are motivated by just taking certain types of assumptions as initial data. Typically claims about consciousness that just end up being incompatible with materialist reduction.
Like what kind of claims do you have in mind?
Let's take claims about the intentionality of experience. Like, let's say you think that having a greenish experience involves being acquainted with a special qualitative property of greenness. Okay. I think even just that simple starting point of thinking of consciousness involving acquaintance with greenness already creates big problems for materialism, because it's hard to see, for example, how there's anything in your brain that looks like acquaintance with greenness. Then we face a kind of choice. Either we agree with that initial premise that consciousness involves acquaintance with greenness, and then maybe materialism's already in trouble. Or we look at what the credentials are of that initial data. I think that the way to defend materialism often is to argue that we weren't really justified in believing in the initial data that was used to motivate non-materialist views. So maybe experience doesn't really involve acquaintance with greenness. It just seems like that.
Right.
So more generally, I think the materialists should go on a kind of aggressive debunking campaign against the kinds of things that people have said to motivate non-reductive views.
So in the first chapter of the book, you lay out a lot of sort of comments, like theses that try to get at what the notion of consciousness that you're talking about is. And then it seems like your overall explanatory strategy is to say, well, consciousness is going to be whatever satisfies most of those or all of them. Or so I'm wondering if you could say a little bit about what theses you think or we do need to satisfy with the theory of consciousness.
Oh, I see. Yeah, so I think the way that people proceed in both the philosophy and the science of consciousness is that we have to start with some just initial assumptions about what kind of thing consciousness is. I think there's a bit of a tendency for people to sort of underestimate of our kind of initial beliefs about consciousness. There's all sorts of things that we believe about it, like we have beliefs about the kind of contents that it has, the way that it presents things to us. We have beliefs about its epistemic properties, like it can justify our beliefs. It can justify about the environment, our introspective beliefs. We think it's unified. We think it streams and flows over time, so on and so forth. There's lots of things that we believe initially about it. And it seems to me inevitably that what the project really amounts to is sort of explaining how there could be, at least for the materialist, is explaining how there could be a thing in the natural world that satisfies well enough that kind of initial picture that we have of consciousness. But in the process of trying to carry out that project, we may well have to clarify what those initial beliefs were, processify them in various ways, and maybe even throw some of them out when we realize that their credentials were suspect once we think things through. So that's sort of how I see, at the most abstract level, how I see the explanatory project is playing out.
And so one of those that may be thrown out is the acquaintance thesis.
Yeah, that's an example of something that I think probably we might want to throw out. Or at least either throw it out or give it a kind of deflationary reading where it doesn't play an important role in metaphysics. So yeah, I'm a fan of the old-fashioned identity theory. The conscious states are just brain states. And I don't think brain states in any kind of inflationary way involve acquaintance with qualitative properties. So if you hold that kind of view, you have to explain, well, why were we tempted to talk that way? I think we can explain that. I think if you think about the functional role of experience, the way that its role basically is to guide perceptual judgments, you can sort of get the sense of why it might be tempting to describe it in terms of acquaintance, even if really it's just a brain state.
Nice. Okay, so it's nice to talk to people who are interested in the identity theory, because that's that's probably my strongest commitment in philosophy is
excellent. We're on the
consciousness or brains. Yeah, I think sorry, go ahead.
I mean, I should be clear. Like, I'm fine with functionalism. When I say the identity theory, I really mean the sort of more broader claim that consciousness is identical with something physical or functional that can be sort of spelled out in objective terms of some kind. Right.
And so, I mean, I guess I'm a little less fine with functionalism, but it's not my mortal enemy or anything like that. But so it's still nice. I mean, because I thought, talking about identity theory, then you talk about identification theories. And so identification theories, you could be a dualist and still endorse a claim like that. I mean, even someone like Philip Goff, who's a panpsychist, puts his view in terms of identity claims as between conscious and identical to something.
Yeah, so just to clarify for people what I mean by identification theory, that's just a specific proposal about what consciousness is, as opposed to the identity theory, which is just this general claim that it is some kind of brain state.
Right.
So yeah, even a dualist could have what I call an identification theory, because they could give some kind of objective account of what the material souls are, or what non-physical phenomenal properties are, or something like that.
But so when you were saying you're a fan of the identity theory, you didn't mean an identification theory
No,
or a specific kind of
I meant a materialist,
Yeah.
reductive materialist identity theory, yes.
And so one of the really core commitments of any kind of identity theory in this sense is the hidden nature view, which I think has a lot of interesting consequences, plays a real interesting role in your argument. So can you tell us?
Yeah, right. So notoriously physicalists think that consciousness and sort of conscious states more generally have a nature that it isn't totally transparent to us introspectively. Obviously, it doesn't seem to you like your conscious experience is constituted by a pattern of neural firings or something like that. And that's the kind of thing that's been the source of the notorious herd problem. So one of the things that I bang on a little bit about at the beginning of the book is that even before we get to questions of materialism and so on, there's just this general issue of whether we're going to be committed to consciousness and particular types of experience having some kind of hidden nature of the kind that physicalists believe in. And I actually just think it's quite hard to avoid that kind of thing, even if you're a dualist. And I think that's quite a powerful consideration, because if people are using this hidden nature idea as an argument against physicalists, which some people do, some fans of the Hodge problem and so on, then I think they're in danger of being hypocrites, basically, because they may well be committed to that in another way. So that's very abstract, just to give you some examples. There's lots of debates about just basically in general, what kind of things experiences are that dualists partake in as well, and also what kind of structure they have. So actually, what we were just talking about a minute ago, does experience involve acquaintance with qualitative properties? That would be a good example of a thing people have debated. I think it's doubtful whether you can just resolve that a priori just by reflecting on your experiences. I think that's partly an empirical question. But if that's right, then whether experience involves acquaintance with qualitative features is a kind of a fact about its hidden nature.
Right.
And I think there's lots of examples like that, some of which are very simple. Like one that I really like, that I talk a fair bit about, is the similarity relations between qualitative properties in your experience. So let's say you're seeing three different colored surfaces and have different brightnesses. There's presumably some fact about the relationship between those brightnesses. And we can make rough and ready judgments about that. We have some access to that kind of structure in our experience. But I don't think that we have infallible sort of a priori access to those similarity relations just by having concepts of those experiences. I think there can be, there's a sense in which that's somewhat beyond our ken. But that would still be a kind of necessary structural feature of experience of the same kind that materialists believe in when they say that experiences are identical with neural states. So I just think that it's quite hard to avoid the conclusion that we're kind of up to our ears in dualists. So that can't be a legitimate complaint against materialists.
You kind of cut out there at the last second. So you said we're up to our ears and these kind of structures.
I feel like, my view is that almost all theorists are going to be up to their ears in commitments to, as it were, hidden features of experience that we can't know about just by introspection and a priori reflection.
So can I ask about these shades?
The complaint that materialists, materialism has that feature, I think, is therefore not really a problem for them, because it's a feature of pretty much any view.
It's ubiquitous in your view. So can I ask about these blue shades? Because I was a bit unclear about this when I was reading the chapter as well. But so is the idea supposed to be that the three shades of blue are so similar that we can't discriminate the differences between them, even though there is like objectively a similarity difference between them? Or how?
I mean, that could be an example. I'm thinking almost any example though, like where you just have any number of items that you're experiencing, and then there's some fact about how they're related in a similarity space. My view is that we do have some access to those similarity facts. We can introspect the structure of our experience, but we don't have infallible access to that.
I see. Yeah.
And part of my case of that is empirical. So if you look at work on psychophysical scaling, there's all sorts of different ways in which you can prompt people to make judgments that reveal the similarity structure of their experience. But different ways of probing that result in incompatible results about what that similarity structure is, which suggests that people are like a little bit inconsistent in the way that they make these judgments. They don't, depending on how you probe them, in response to exactly the same experience. So I think there's a strong empirical case that there's a kind of fallible process whereby we make these introspective judgments. It's not, this isn't just totally transparent to us.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I guess I was slightly misunderstanding the case there. It's more general than I thought it was. And this is just one example of the kinds of hidden structures that you talk about. So it's like, you know, is holism true about conscious experience, or is it the atomic? You know,
yeah. There's lots of examples. Yeah, like whether we have a kind of single holistic field of which everything else is an aspect, or whether it's built up of little atoms. That would be another example. Things like exclusion relations. So can you have a reddish and greenish experience, or an experience that's reddish and greenish, or do those exclude each other? I don't think you can settle that just by thinking about reddishness and greenishness. I think that's an empirical question.
Yeah, there's some actual work that was done on that, which can be interpreted as producing those kinds of experiences.
Exactly, yeah. It seems like we can only decide that by actually looking at the kinds of brain states that underwrite those experiences and seeing whether they are themselves compatible or incompatible. Maybe I should just say a little bit more about why this is significant for sort of traditional debates that people have been having. So I think it matters a lot for how we think about the hard problem. So many of us, including me, have these explanatory gap intuitions about consciousness. And so the idea basically is that however much you know about the physical constitution of some system, and however much you know about correlations between these physical states and conscious states, there will still be this residual feeling that we don't understand why they're connected in the way they are, or even why consciousness exists at all. That's the classic explanatory gap. Now, I don't want to deny that we have these intuitions, but I'm a bit skeptical as to whether we've given an adequate account of what the underlying explanatory problem is that these intuitions are supposed to track. And the way I see things is that the debate's gone down a very specific path, influenced by people like Frank Jackson and Dave Chalmers, whereby the idea is that what the explanatory problem consists in is this lack of a priori deducibility of consciousness facts from physical facts. Right. And it's because we can't deduce them that we feel like there's this explanatory problem. Now, I think that that's not an explanation of the explanatory problem. And my reason for that is that I think there's loads of examples where we have that same structure, but we don't feel like there's any kind of explanatory problem. And so in fact, all these examples of these sort of possible hidden natures to experience that we're just talking about provide really nice examples. Go with like similarity structure again. If I think this experience exists, and this experience exists, sort of pointing to three brightness experiences, that might then lead as necessitate that there's a certain structure in that experience because they exist and they have that structure. But it's not a priori for me that if they exist, then they have that structure. That's a hidden feature of them. But if I'm told that, I don't feel like there's some kind of explanatory gap there. I'm not like, why do they have that structure? And similarly for these if I'm told that holism is true, or if I'm told that experience involves acquaintance with qualitative features, or if I'm told that redness excludes greenness, or whatever it is, in many of these cases, we're not going to think, oh, but why? How could it be? Even though I think that they'll all involve analogous inferential epistemic gaps. So I think that's a good, strong argument that it's a kind of a red herring, that at best the epistemic gap thing is more like a component of the explanatory problem. It's not the full source of it. And I kind of strongly suspect that really what makes people have these explanatory gap intuitions is not the epistemic gap thing. It's something more like Leibniz's law. Basically, our experience seems to have certain features, and brains or larger physical systems don't seem to have features like that. And so there just seem to be very different kinds of things.
Right.
And that's why we have the explanatory gap intuition, not the epistemic gap thing. So I think that's been a little bit of a red herring.
That's Descartes' second argument.
Yeah, I mean, right. I mean, it's
the one that convinces undergraduates.
Yeah. I mean, it's not like people aren't aware that makes it puzzling. I just think that that's where the emphasis should have been all along.
Yeah. So, I mean, do you think that this kind of inferential gap is going to hold for even like sort of an idealized rational agent that has all the relevant information, or is it just a kind of a symptom of our impoverished access to conscious experience? I mean, is it something that's going to hold in the limit?
Yeah, because I think the source of it is the special kinds of concept. I believe in a kind of phenomenal concepts idea where we have these special concepts of experience that have their basis in introspection. And then the way that we understand other people having experiences is basically by analogy to our own case. We imagine them having experiences.
Right.
For example. And however much you know about the physical constitution of some other system, you can imagine that they don't have experiences. So I think that's fairly trivially true. And that's why there's this zombie thing. But I also think that we don't need to, that is the idea that it's conceivable that a system is a zombie, however much you know about its physical constitution. It's conceivable that it lacks conscious experience. But I do think it's important not to kind of overplay the significance of that, even though I agree that zombies are conceivable. I do nonetheless think that we can, once we have a more complete understanding of how brains work, and we've gone through this process of thinking really carefully about how we understand consciousness, what we really mean by a lot of these sort of initial data that we take as important to preserve in a theory of consciousness. I think that in theory we will be able to see how our physical system can have something that satisfies that sort of initial theory that we have of consciousness. And in that way, I think we can have a satisfactory explanatory account of how it could exist in the physical world. It won't be a priori that if it has this physical state, then it's conscious. But that doesn't mean that we don't have a fully satisfactory explanatory theory. So in that way, my view is somewhat similar to analytic functionalists who just think that once you have the physical knowledge, then you can just deduce everything about consciousness.
Is this the way you're going to get around the Leibniz law kind of worries?
Yeah, I think for any example of an argument like that, we have to think, okay, well, what do we really mean by consciousness having this weird feature that seems to be non-natural? And try to, either just take, either explain how something natural could have that feature, or probably more likely engage in some kind of debunking where we argue that we didn't really know in the first place that consciousness had that awkward feature. So basically I think there's enough kind of the materials has a lot of strategies up their sleeve for dealing with that kind of problem.
Right. And each one of these strategies is going to lead to kind of a deflationism, or is it? Do you think it's not possible to have these sort of strategies and preserve a kind of inner light, special divide consciousness view?
Well, in theory, we could. Go through this whole process of trying to figure out what consciousness is, and then conclude that we have immaterial souls. and then there would be some really deep distinction in the world between the things that are conscious and the things that aren't. I just doubt empirically that that's what we're going to find.
Yeah, right. So that's the only thing that would do it, though. There's no. So the basic, I mean,
I even think that immaterial cells might not actually cut it in terms of really giving us the kind of difference between conscious things and unconscious things that we seem to want. I mean, I feel like the intuition is that we have a special subjective qualitative thing going on, and that other entities that don't have that just don't have anything special and subjective and qualitative. There's this tradition of trying to do justice to that by just sort of throwing something non-physical into the mix. But I think that's not enough. I mean, just because you've got some weird non-physical doodah, that doesn't imply that it has special subjective qualitative features.
Right. So you could have a view where you have some kind of non-physical property which didn't confer the kind of status that we think consciousness does.
Imagine that materialism is true for us, and then I don't know, some angels turn up or something, and they're non-physical. So we're on the wrong side, as it were, of the deep divide in nature between the, the non-physical and the physical beings. I don't think in that situation we'd be like, oh no, like we're zombies.
Yeah,
we're lacking this special thing just because they have some weird non-physical thing. No, it would just be they've got a special version of mentality that has a non-physical substrate. We have one that has a physical substrate, but other than that, pretty much we're on a par. So even dualism doesn't necessarily do justice to consciousness. At least it doesn't do justice to the intuitions about it that we have that make us feel like we don't understand how it fits in the natural world.
Yeah, and even if there were non-physical zombies which showed up, that would just show that you have the other side of that problem as well, right? That they're non-physical but they lack consciousness. Then it's not non-physicality that's doing any work.
Yeah, certainly right. Just non-physicality alone isn't enough to give you the special thing, for sure.
Yeah. But so, I mean, I find, obviously, I'm sure you get a lot of puzzled looks when you talk about this stuff, but I do find it puzzling. So we have to work our way into it, I think, to really get to the question I want to ask. But so large part of the argument is that there's this hidden nature, and that this can be objectively accessed, even by creatures that lack consciousness. So, your famous Martian scientists that lack consciousness could still pick out our states in roughly the same way, latch onto the same states, not in the same way because they lack consciousness, but they would latch onto the same sort of states that we talk about when we talk about conscious experience.
Yeah, I do think that we should think of it that way, that in theory we can form objective concepts of these subjective states. And I think that's going to be true across a wide variety of different metaphysics, like whether you're a reductive materialist or dualist or whatever.
And so, and then they would have an equally good access to those social, that objective access is equally good. I guess that's where I'm.
Equally good for what is the issue.
Right, yeah.
I do think that if you're trying to understand something like the significance of consciousness in the natural world, just as a natural phenomenon, like its causal role, its explanatory role, like what type of thing it really ultimately is, that kind of thing. Then you're actually better off. This is weird. I agree, this is counterintuitive, but I just think that you're actually better off thinking of it objectively. So it seems to us like we're in this privileged position understanding the nature of it. It's just this kind of thing whose nature is just revealed in having it. But if it's kind of hidden nature, and that hidden nature is best described objectively, then there's a sense in which we don't really know what it is subjectively through introspection. If we really want to know what it is, we have to describe it in this other way. So so zombie Martian scientists can know better than us what consciousness is. I do think that.
But better in the sense that they could have a more objective access to its intrinsic nature, or to its like ultimate metaphysical status or something like that.
Yeah, something like that, yeah.
So why is that knowing it better than we do, though? So I guess that's what I'm.
Well, it's knowing it better in one respect. It's sort of knowing better what it is. I mean, I agree that. I mean, there's a sense in which we know it really intimately because we're in these states and we have this special way of knowing about them introspectively, and so of course, they don't have that. So if that's what you care about, is sort of having it and knowing it in that special way, then they completely lack that.
Right.
If you want to know sort of what it really is, then I think you're better off being the zombie Martian scientist.
But why is that so? Why is that a better way of knowing? So you agree that there's a way that we have of knowing about our conscious experiences, which is they can't have. And why isn't that the way? So maybe you don't know about its ultimate metaphysical nature. You can't tell what state it is. These various things will be hidden from us. But why isn't the important way of knowing about it the way we know about it? Why isn't that more important?
Well, you should say important for what purpose, or
well, this gets so yeah.
I think people are going to say, well, it's important for understanding why it's significant or something like that. I think they are going to say that, like, because I say some things that sound initially quite crazy, like you don't have to be conscious to have a life that is worth living, that kind of thing.
Yeah, that's.
And people are going to say, no, I have the inner light of awareness, and if you don't have that, then it's just complete darkness within. And so you obviously lack this really amazing, important, special, subjective thing.
Yeah.
But I think, I think that's misleading, and we see things more clearly. We see what's going on more clearly if we think of everything objectively, in the eyes of the zombie Martian scientist.
Why do you think that?
Because they see the nature of these things in the way that we don't. So to compare us, let's look at like some AI or something that's really smart.
Yeah.
But has a very different kind of hardware and sufficiently different cognitive architecture that it's doubtful whether they are conscious, even if they have some similarly sophisticated form of perception and cognition. Then looked at objectively, if you compare me with this AI, then you've just got these two really fancy control systems there. The zombie Martian scientist isn't going to see some special internal light inside me and see just only darkness inside the AI system. No, they're just going to say, there's just these two different types of architectures. And other than that, they're kind of on a par. There's not something really special going on with these humans. And I think that would be right. I think they have the correct insight into that. And this idea that there's this kind of inner light, and that gives us this really special thing, I think is kind of an illusion.
Yeah. So I want to get to that, but I guess I'm trying to ask a slightly different question at this point. So why isn't it the case that introspectively we have access to something like the experiential nature of the thing? So we may not have access to its full fundamental nature, but we have access to something which is an essential part of what the thing is, right? I mean, yeah. If it's a pain, and if I'm aware of the pain in my knee, then it being painful is part of its essential nature.
Well, yeah, we know. Yeah, we do know some things about conscious experience through introspection, for sure. We have special way of being, referring to it with these phenomenal properties, phenomenal concepts. Sorry.
Right.
We have knowledge of its sort of structural features. We have knowledge of the kind of content that it has, and so on and so forth. So we can give these rich descriptions of the kinds of experiences that we have introspectively, and that massively constrains the kind of thing that it could be. But it doesn't tell us everything.
It doesn't tell us everything.
I guess I think that I think the zombie Martian scientists can, in a way, have access to all of that as well. That's the thing. Not using the same concepts, for sure. They can't use phenomenal concepts to describe that. But anything that we can point to and describe introspectively, they can also describe, but just using different concepts.
Right, but they're missing out on like an important feature of the thing.
No, I don't agree with that. So you might say, oh, yeah, there's the painfulness of pain. And right. If they're looking at our brain, they don't see the painfulness of pain. But I think the painfulness of pain just is a pattern of neural firing or something like that. And they can describe that. So they do know about the painfulness of pain, but just under a different mode of presentation.
Right. No, I agree with all that, because I have sympathy with the identity theory, but there's still, I mean, I guess I don't want to beat a dead horse, and I know.
No. I think this is pretty crucial.
Yeah. So they can pick out the same state in terms of neural firing. They don't know what it's like to be in that state. Right? They don't have access to that,
Right.
even though they can describe our access to it in completely objective terms. But
right, but no,
if sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt. Sorry.
Oh, well, no, I mean, I'm just rambling on this point, but I think it just seems like if it's an identity theory, then it goes both ways. So its fundamental nature is being a brain state, but it's also being painful, right? The painfulness is what the brain state is. Right. So they would be missing out on that aspect of the identity, the other side of the identity claim. And that seems like a part of the essential thing.
I see. Yeah, well, this is a really tricky point, notoriously tricky. If we go down the road of saying that there's some special qualitative feature of experience, something like it's the painfulness of the pain, and that's a feature of it that is not even described from an objective point of view, then we're on really dangerous territory, because it seems like there's this special feature that it has that we just can't even access by objective means. That's like the famous Max Black objection to the identity theory. So I think what we have to do is like avoid making that initial step of saying that there's some special feature of it that can't be described objectively. It's just the painfulness of the pain, true, but that is something that can also be fully described in objective terms.
Yeah, so I guess I'm skeptical of that move. If the only reason to posit that is to avoid like not being a dualist or something, then I guess I'd rather. I don't know. It just seems like that's part of the way the objective data that we're trying to capture here is that there's this thing there that we may not know its ultimate metaphysical nature, but we know its experiential nature by acquaintance or something close to it, right? I mean.
Yeah. No. Okay. Well, I think to make progress here, we maybe need to talk a little bit more about what the options are for understanding what kind of thing the painfulness of pain is. So, for example, some people think that the painfulness of pain is this special kind of intrinsic feature of the experience, and that when we describe the experience objectively, we just sort of describe it purely structurally, and then that doesn't give us access to this sort of intrinsic qualia that sort of fill in the structure. And as you know, like that leads some people to believe in things like panpsychism.
Yes.
Ultimately, I'm not going to get into the argument for that now, but physical descriptions are purely structural and therefore leave something out about what they're describing, namely its intrinsic nature. But introspection can reveal the intrinsic nature of pain or what have you. So that's one way you could think of it. But I'm not sure that we're just forced down that road by acknowledging there's this thing, the painfulness of pain, that we're aware of. I mean, I'm not particularly strongly committed to denying that the painfulness of pain is this intrinsic thing that is not fully described using objective concepts, but I'm also not committed to accepting that, because the painfulness of pain just could be this structural thing that can be described fully using structural concepts. I don't see that.
Yeah, and I don't want to. I mean, I'm not a panpsychist. I'm not. I mean, I guess I take that view seriously, but I don't believe it really, or the motivation for it. But so I'm not trying to suggest that, but I'm just trying to suggest that there seems to be something that the Martian scientist is missing, which is important to understanding the nature of the physical state that they're describing.
Well, I think they're not able to introspect it and therefore be aware of it in the way that we are. Right. But that's more like they lack a particular way of epistemically accessing it. But I would distinguish that from lack of knowledge of the type of thing that it is, like what its metaphysics is, what kind of thing it is, and so on. It's a bit like if you've never seen or touched some water, there's a way of accessing water that you haven't enjoyed, as it were. Yeah. And someone who merely knows the physics of water doesn't know it in that way and can't imagine touching it and so on. But that doesn't mean that they lack knowledge of the kind of thing that water is. It just means that they lack a particular way of accessing water. And I think that's what you could say about introspection of consciousness too.
Yeah, I mean, I like that analogy, except for that, I guess I would say it seems that in the water case, the way that it feels is not essential to its watery nature. I mean, there's dry earth and all these, we can imagine these other.
No, fair enough. Okay. I mean, yeah, there's a way. Sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. You finish your thought.
Yeah, no, I agree that there's a way in which the case that I just gave is a little bit parasitic on the consciousness case, because maybe what you're lacking if you have never seen water is the special kinds of experiences people have when they see or touch water. But still, the abstract point holds that there's a special way of accessing water through perception.
Right.
I guess you're going to say, well, there aren't, in the consciousness case, it seems like there's features of the phenomenon that you don't know about, whereas in water, we don't necessarily want to say that there's features of water that you get access to only by seeing water rather than reading a book about water. Like that.
Right. Yeah. They're contingent in a way that painfulness is not.
Yeah, I get the intuition, but I also think that basically, I think we can see our way past that. We can just entirely explain this in terms of our access to the phenomenon.
So I guess maybe at this point, what would you, I mean, I know you're kind of skeptical of views that build access into the nature of phenomenal consciousness or consciousness in general. But what would you say to someone who says at this point, well, access is built into it, right? So that you can't distinguish them in this way. And this gets to kind of the methodological puzzle. I know you have some things to say about, Ned's argument there. And so anyway, yeah. So what do you think about this this idea that part of what it is to experience something is to have access to the experience, so that you can't separate those things?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a sense in which I'm committed to denying that, because if consciousness has some nature that you can't just automatically access by having the experience, then there's a kind of access consciousness view that I'm committed to denying. But but it could still be that access has a kind of weaker role to play in individuating experiences. So it could be like it could be that to have phenomenal character at all, there has to be some kind of cognitive access that the subject has to aspects of the content of the experience or something. So you could say that kind of thing, but still think that experiences have a hidden nature. So I'm not just fully committed to denying any form of view on which cognitive access to experience is sort of part of what makes it what it is. But I certainly think there's a lot of versions of that view that are too strong.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's not even necessarily cognitive access. I mean, that's one form of access, but there may be other forms that aren't cognitive, which still count as a kind of access.
Sorry, can you say a little bit more about what you have in mind?
Well, it's no one's really done any good work on this, I'd say, but sometimes people like Ned say that you can have a self-representational kind of thing that doesn't involve cognitive access, but just involves a kind of experiential access, something that allows you to know, that the me-ishness part of the experience or whatever, which isn't cognitive. So I think that's a possibility. I don't think I've seen anyone flesh it out in any serious way, but I don't know if that's contradictory or self-refuting in any way.
Oh, so you're talking about something like a same order view of consciousness where just the state kind of represents itself in some sense.
Yeah,
gives it
that's one version of it. That's one version of it, right?
Yeah. So that doesn't involve any kind of cognitive access necessarily.
Right, exactly.
You could even have a completely inaccessible experience that had that kind of reflexive, representational nature.
Right.
Yeah. So then, no, I mean, I'm open to that. I'm not saying anything that would conflict with that, I don't think.
Well, but if you did have a view like that, then wouldn't it put pressure on these Martian scientists, because they wouldn't have access to, I mean, they'd have access to the state, but they might miss its self-representational character entirely.
Okay, but we're imagining that they have some kind of objective omniscience. So they look inside our brains and they see that there's these states that have this special reflexive representational feature. So it's assuming that that's the kind of thing that could be described objectively somehow. I don't see why they couldn't know about that.
Yeah. Why would you assume it could be described objectively if that's what the phenomenal aspect of it is?
Well, yeah, it's tricky because it. I mean, basically, in the end, I think that everything that exists is just part of the objective world, and so in some very thin sense, you can describe it objectively. But just on the but going back to the more specific example of self-representation, I just presumably, like, if we can give a clear account of what it even means for a state to represent itself, that'll just be in something like functional terms. Maybe it has a structure where it has one part that kind of relates to the other part in some way that makes it or something like that. But it just seems like any kind of account of what that even means will just spell that out in objective terms. I suppose, so you're thinking maybe, no. Sorry, I'm losing my voice. Let me have some water. You're thinking that you could have a self-representational theory where there's just something inherently subjective or phenomenal about the notion of self-representation.
Yes. I mean, sometimes I think that's like what Ned's view amounts to, that there's a physical state that has that property.
But then, then I would play the same game with self-representation that I would just play with consciousness in general. So I would say, okay, yeah, we've got this special subjective concept of self-representation, but whatever it picks out is just some feature of the objective world that can, in theory, be described in objective terms also. Right.
I agree with all that, but I guess the only thing I'm trying to press you on this whole time is that the Martians would be missing something. And it wouldn't be, and if it was just a matter of that they had different access to it, that might be the thing that matters.
Well, I mean, so you have to say what's missing, because like, I think if you were, sorry, it's quite unfortunate that I'm losing my voice.
That's okay, sorry.
I must be like shouting or something like that.
Doesn't seem that way to me, I don't know.
Okay, yeah.
Oh, this bluster won't save you, Jeff. Come on now.
Yeah, well, I mean, okay, so if you think that there's something that they don't know, then I think one way of getting at this is just to think, okay, well, what kind of metaphysical picture would imply that knowing all the objective structure of the brain means that you don't know everything? And I agree that there's this kind of approach where you say there's this intrinsic nature to physical matter that is not revealed by those kinds of structural descriptions, and so
that's the Russellian monism.
If you had a sort of Russellian monist kind of picture of the physical world, I see how that would be one way to say that there's something missing from the zombie Martian scientist's understanding of the brain that could potentially be relevant for consciousness. So I agree that there's that route. But then one thing to say there then is that it's not really that if you have that kind of picture, then it's not just that they don't know everything about consciousness, they don't know everything about anything. Because, like,
right, exactly.
Describe a rock or something, then they don't know the nature of the rock either. So if they can have an understanding of consciousness that is just as good as the understanding that they can have of things like rocks, then they're still doing pretty well.
Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, I understand the view. It's, I guess I just really it's probably my shortcoming, but I just have real trouble understanding how they have just as good an understanding of the state, but lacking the experiential aspect of it. It seems to me that's part of what the state is. That is what it is.
I think if you really are consistent identity theorists, then you say all these, the what its likeness, the qualitative nature, blah blah blah, all that just is. It is nothing above and beyond this physical activity. And so if you know about the physical, I mean, yeah, I agree it's counterintuitive, because it seems like if you describe it qua physical activity, you, in a certain sense, haven't mentioned its qualitative character. But we have to say that what that amounts to is that you just haven't described it using certain concepts. Not that not that there actually is something about its metaphysics that you've left out.
Yeah. I guess because I think about it from the other point of view. So what that brain state really is a pain. So you can do it both ways. It's an identity, right? I mean,
Yeah.
the pain is nothing but the brain state, but the brain state is nothing but a pain. So it seems like they don't really grasp they don't grasp the state in its full nature, because they are missing half of it. They're missing the part where it's experiential, and that is an essential aspect of that state. That's what it is. It's an experience.
Yeah, I obviously I feel the intuition that's driving you to say things like that, but I think you're just not being a fully consistent identity theorist who say that kind of thing, because you're making it sound like in something in the metaphysics of the experience has been left out by the objective description. But that can't be right. If you really are an identity theorist, then you're committed to saying no. Everything about it has been described objectively.
Yeah, everything about it's ultimate. I see what you're saying, but I don't know. We've been going on about this for a while, so I may just give up. But
I'm sorry that I'm not saying anything to assuage.
No, it's my fault, because I don't think I'm being very articulate. But anyway, so let's suppose we grant the point that the Martian scientists can understand everything there is about the state in the full way, and they go back to your example about the AI and you, and the Martian is looking at the two of you, and you say, well, there's nothing special about you system versus that system. They're just complex control things. So isn't one, I mean, this is kind of, I take it, part of the point that Ned makes in his response to you, and where he coins the hegemony of the third person charge at you. So isn't one of the things that's different is the fact that we go on, for an hour talking about how puzzling consciousness is, and that they're going to notice that we use these terms in a certain way that the AI system is not using. And there's going to be something that they're going to know. Well, there's got to be, won't they infer that there's something about this state that they're missing out on because of the way we talk about it, basically, I guess.
Well, yeah, so they're going to note that we talk about these states with great puzzlement, at least if we're people in philosophy departments in the United States of America. That's right. And it could be that when they look at this AI system, the AI system is not similarly puzzled about its own internal states. But it could be, actually. I mean, it's not, it seems to me that we can't rule out that you could have a system that has some analog of phenomenal concepts and what have you. Some analog of the psychological features of us that make us puzzled about consciousness. But they have it directed at some other kind of internal state. So it's not obvious that, as it were, the kind of puzzlement that we have requires consciousness rather than something else.
Yeah, that's an interesting point.
But even if they aren't puzzled by their internal states in the way that we are, that will be one asymmetry between us. But I don't think that's when we think about the asymmetry of like the lights on and then the darkness over there. We don't think that it consists in the fact that we're puzzled about consciousness, rather that we think the puzzlement is a sort of insight into this special kind of internal state that we're in.
Right.
But they're not going to see anything like that. They're just going to see that we have some quirky functional architecture that leads us to be puzzled. And they'll be able to fully explain why we're puzzled just in functional terms. And
so now it's starting to sound like this is a kind of illusionism, that once you explain like the things we say about consciousness, then you've explained consciousness.
I don't quite think that, because I think that we can be realists about consciousness. We can say that it exists. We can say that there's some internal state of us, or maybe some state of some larger system, that basically satisfies enough of our ordinary thinking about consciousness that it's totally reasonable to say that it just is consciousness. So in that sense, I'm a realist about consciousness. But yeah, when it comes to the explanatory worries and so on, a big part of it is just causally explaining why we have those intuitions, explaining where they come from, but also looking at what they actually track that's real.
Right.
And yeah, I think the thing that's distinctive about illusionists is they just think that most of our intuitions just don't track anything.
Yeah.
But I think you can sort of explain, you can you can buy into quite a lot of their kind of debunking project without going as far as being a complete anti-realist.
Right.
Precisely,
Okay.
enough of what we ordinarily think about consciousness does apply to some real thing.
So, because why wouldn't the Martian infer that there is something that there? So what it sounds like what you're saying is, well, the Martian's going to be able to explain all the things that we say. They're going to say, oh, well, this guy says he's puzzled about consciousness. That's because this state's connected to that state. There's this functional blah, blah, blah. That produces the utterance. And then they'd be done. They'd be satisfied and say, okay, we're done. But why wouldn't they be led to the conclusion that they're missing something? Namely, whatever is the source of this puzzlement. I mean, I sort of see that both options are there, but why would the Martian go one way versus the other? Because my intuition would be like they would infer, gee, there must be some aspect of this we're not getting.
Well, but if they can fully explain why we have these intuitions, that we have this special insight into this thing, purely in physical terms, it's hard to see why they would then be tempted to conclude nonetheless that they're missing out. It's a bit like let's say we're studying people who believe in ghosts, and we can fully satisfactorily explain why they think that they're a ghost just in terms of things that don't involve ghosts. But they say, no, we have some special insight that there really are these ghosts. Or like actually religious belief is a little bit like this. People just think that they have this direct connection to God, that kind of thing. If you can explain why they have that sense of a direct connection to God in a way that doesn't like involve actually believing that there really is some special insight there, then that's fully satisfactory. So similarly,
or it's question begging. I mean, it's one or the other.
Yeah. Okay. Well, yeah, it could be question begging. So yeah, well, I mean, what I should say, one thing I kind of do think about this whole business of philosophy of consciousness is that it is possible that there are kind of multiple sort of equilibrium points that you could end up with at sort of the end of ideal theorizing.
Right.
So maybe someone could flesh out a kind of non-reductive or dualist view or something like that, with a special epistemology and so on, where it all kind of ends up being a kind of internally coherent package, where there really is something that we have special insight into that the zombie Martian scientists can't see and so on. But I think it's really hard to do that. I think you'd need some really weird metaphysics and epistemology to get that all to work.
So the whole package may be self-consistent, but it may just be so like hodgepodge and stuck together that it's not.
Well, yeah, if it was too hodgepodge, then it wouldn't have all the theoretical virtues. So I'm imagining that, I'm being generously imagining that you could really flesh it out in such a way that it sort of has those theoretical virtues, but I think it would be much more alien than a lot of the kind of dualist views you see on the market these days. Partly because you'd have to have some really weird kind of supernatural epistemology to explain how we can know that consciousness has all these special qualitative intrinsic features that are physically irreducible and so on. So to me, it's like just more attractive to explore this kind of materialist option where it seems like metaphysics and the epistemology and so on is going to be more straightforward, even though it's true that there's going to be an element of kind of deflation and debunking that goes into that.
Yeah. Okay. So now let's get into we've been talking about deflationism for a long time, but let's get into the significance aspect of it. Because so it's one thing to say that the AI system and you can't be distinguished in any deep and important way by the Martian scientists. But you go further than that and say, well, actually, you're both equally valuable, right? There's no significant moral status which attaches to the consciousness. So they may lack consciousness, but they may have something which plays enough of a role. I mean, you mentioned that a second ago. So I guess I'm a bit puzzled by what you mean by what state could play the role and yet not be consciousness.
Yes, this is definitely quite tricky territory. So let's go slowly. So I've got this idea that we can talk about the consciousness role, but I need to be clear about what I mean by that. I don't think that there's a sort of single kind of nice unified functional role that we associate with consciousness then can be kind of multiply realized in different instances. If there was, then actually it'd be plausible just to say that's what consciousness is.
Right.
It's just a functional role. Instead, we've got something like this kind of complex set of pre-theoretical ideas about consciousness that can be clarified in different directions depending on what we discover empirically. You can sort of just, you can processify the thing in different directions, and you can just take different subsets of that, and also different aspects of what we discover empirically about it, and basically see that there could be other systems that resemble us in these different respects. And so we could say they have a consciousness-like state, but they may, but different beings with consciousness-like states might resemble us in totally different ways. So my way of thinking, because system A is in a consciousness-like state and system B is in a consciousness-like state, that doesn't mean that they actually have anything very interesting in common, because they may resemble us in different ways. So I do think that there's this sort of universe of consciousness-like properties, but it's kind of, they're more kind of related by family resemblance and resemblance to us in different ways, not by all having some single nice unified functional feature or something like that.
So I mean, is the distinction between pseudo consciousness and quasi consciousness playing a role here?
It's important that that's how I'm thinking about consciousness-like states, because that's a pretty good reason, I think, for denying that they all are conscious, and because they don't have some nice natural feature all in common. You could, here's the thing, so you could just decide that you're going to use the term consciousness to refer to this very kind of superficial, somewhat disjunctive kind of family resemblance of features. And in a way, I don't have a problem with that. You can just talk that way if you want,
yeah.
and say that they're all conscious, but then you'd be using the term just in a way that was really very superficial. So an analogy that I give is the concept of representation. So we kind of start off with a pretty vague kind of folk concept of representation, and then we processify and clarify in various ways and discover empirically that the more specific kinds of representation exist and play important roles in cognitive systems, and I mean, in various kinds of artifacts and so on. And all these things do sort of have something in common that make us call them representations, but it's more like a kind of family resemblance thing, and it's pretty vague. The more interesting explanatory kinds of representation are the more specific ones that we then characterize in theory. And I sort of think of consciousness as a bit like that. When we try and figure out what consciousness is, what we're doing is figuring out what thing in us that can be more clearly characterized and play an important role in our cognitive system is the thing that matches closely enough our sort of initial way of thinking about what consciousness is. But just like with representation, in different contexts, we could discover different states using that same methodology. Like if some aliens have something a bit like our initial beliefs about consciousness, but then do the science of consciousness on themselves, I don't think they'll necessarily, in the long run, conclude that consciousness is the same thing that we think that it is. Instead, I think the right picture is just that there's this family of states that different systems can be in that all resemble each other in various ways. And if you like, you can say they're all consciousness-like.
So, but just to be clear, the notion of consciousness-like states doesn't involve phenomenality, right? There's nothing that it's like to be in these states for the creatures that have them.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think sort of that's right. I mean, if by what it's likeness you mean the thing in us that is this natural property that whose nature we can uncover through philosophical scientific investigation, yeah, they don't necessarily have that. But I have some pretty big hedges on this these days.
Okay, good. Let me hear the hedges.
I mean, one thing is, so one thing that's going on when we say like the lights are on or off is that we are sort of extending our imaginative reach to some system, saying you can kind of step into its shoes and picture things from its point of view. Now, I'm a little bit, this is a bit of a, I'm a little bit tempted, at least, I don't know how high my credence really is in this particular move, but I'm a little bit tempted to say that we can legitimately step into the shoes of beings that don't have the thing in us that we call consciousness. That is, you can legitimately imagine their point of view. Because as long as there's enough similarity between their internal state and your internal state, then it's reasonable to sort of simulate them using your internal state. Because you are.
So in what way is the similarity? What dimension along which dimension is the similarity?
Well, yeah, they might have some kind of structural, functional similarity to you, such that if you simulate their internal state using your internal state, it's similar enough that you get some interesting purchase on them that way, in the way that you do with other people when you simulate their internal state with yours.
So you can do this with like the Google self-driving car.
Well, maybe that's just so different from us that it's not really going to get much purchase on it by trying to imagine its point of view. But if it was something like a AI system that had something like the architecture that we have, at least very abstractly, then maybe you could get enough purchase on it that it would be worthwhile, as it were, to imagine its point of view. And I'm a little inclined to say that's all that's ever going on when you imagine the point of view of things. You're just sort of successfully simulating them. And then for that purpose, it doesn't really matter whether they have the thing that we call consciousness. They just have to be similar enough to you that there's some point to doing that. So in that way, like a kind of, if you go down that route, you can kind of deflate the lights on thing, because I can step into its shoes and imagine the view. Even if you think of the space of all the things that you can successfully simulate using your own internal state, they might not all have some deep property in common. They just have to resemble you enough that it's worthwhile to simulate them. So yeah, and you could, if you like, say, oh well, they're the conscious things, but that would be to sort of use the concept of consciousness to mean the things whose point of view I can step into.
So I mean, clearly you don't buy Nagel's like argument that points of view come in types, and there are concepts that apply like to the bat's phenomenology that we can't take up.
No, well, yeah, no, I do think there are different types of experience. So yeah, if the bat has some kind of qualitative way of sensing that's qualitatively quite different from ours, then that's a way in which I can't successfully simulate them.
Right. Okay.
I might be able to successfully simulate the structure of their experience or something like that.
So the states being similar to other states, the quality spaces or whatever.
Yes, in general, it's going to be easier to simulate things structurally than it is to simulate them like intrinsically. But all that structure is phenomenal structure, though. So I'm still, or at least in the case of conscious beings. When it comes to things like these non-conscious but consciousness-like creatures, then creatures who have consciousness-like internal states, then it's a little bit more tricky to think about how to describe that. But I still don't, even in those cases, I kind of think, well, why not? Why can't I do the same thing with them that I do when I imagine the internal state of a conscious being? So the lights are on them. The lights are on even though they're not conscious. I know that sounds very strange.
So it sounds like you're saying they're conscious, but just in a way that's different than us.
But here's one way of thinking about my picture. So I think we can just distinguish different concepts of phenomenal consciousness that have different emphasis. Mm-hmm. So one way of thinking of it is it's like this natural property, this deep natural property that we have, that has a bunch of these features that initially we think consciousness has, sort of satisfies our folk picture of consciousness well enough. Call that the kind of natural property view of consciousness. I tend to think that is how most people in philosophy are thinking of it. I don't know whether most ordinary people are thinking of it that way, but that's certainly a dominant strain in thinking about phenomenology.
Absolutely, yeah.
But then you can have the concept of the being such that I can imagine their point of view in a way that wouldn't grossly misrepresent it. And there's also the being such that they have something that matters morally in the way that consciousness does. That's another space of beings. There's the space of beings that have something that is superficially, functionally kind of like consciousness. So like, again, like if you think about sort of the project of locating consciousness in us, like starting with your initial beliefs and then taking all the empirical input and then figuring out what it is. You can decenter that whole project on different beings, like some aliens could do the science of consciousness thing on themselves, or like some fish could do it on themselves, or we can do it on the fish. It's not clear that that same methodology will yield the same answer to what the thing is in all these different contexts. In fact, I don't think it will. So you could, by consciousness, you could mean just the disjunction of all the things that you could, by some method like that, ascertain as being what consciousness is in all the different contexts. It's just a little big disjunction, as it were. And that's fine. You can talk about it that way. I don't have a problem with using the concept of consciousness that way. But then you have to admit that that would be, in some ways, revisionary of our ordinary thinking, because there wouldn't necessarily be some deep thing that they all have in common. It would just be more like a kind of tangled web of like resemblances.
Right. I guess I don't really see why it's a deep revision, given that the states satisfy most of the things that, or a lot of the things that we ordinarily associate with consciousness. And there's a point of view involved, and there's something that it's like to be in those states for those creatures, even if it's, so it doesn't seem, where's the revision? The revision is just that there's a unifying.
Well, they don't, well, you made it sound like they do have some deep thing in common, but that's kind of what
it sounds like they do.
And I'll be fine with that, but I'm thinking it's not really like that, because I think about let's go with the let's try a different example. So in water again, because that's one thing the philosophers are used to thinking about. So
say that again. Sorry,
the thing that plays the watery role on our planet. Oh, sorry, water. Let's think about water.
Yeah.
As just
okay.
Okay. So like, there's this thing that plays the watery role on planet Earth. It's the thing that fills lakes. It's this clear liquid. It's the thing that we drink and so on. So we can imagine being in some situation where something else played that role. And what the role is itself kind of up for grabs. Like, you could, when you say there's something else that plays a role, do you mean it's the thing you find in lakes? Do you mean that it's the thing that's part of your body that you drink? Is it the thing that comes out of the sky and it was rain? Okay. Right. So I could take the disjunction of all the things that could be in some vague way water-like. Like if they come out of clouds on some alien planet, or they're part of the body that's the liquid, that's the predominant thing that's part of the body of the aliens, or whatever it is. But if you take that massive disjunction of all the vaguely watery-like things, they don't necessarily have anything in common with each other. Maybe they're all liquids, maybe or something like that, but that doesn't distinguish them from other liquids.
Right.
So similarly, I can take this disjunction of all the things that are vaguely consciousness-like, that in some way or other important way resemble what we have when we're conscious. But if you take any random two of them, they don't necessarily have anything really deep in common. That's the point. Like
metaphysically, they don't have a lot in common.
Yeah, so except that they resemble us. So and one way of putting this is that if you do it this way, it's very kind of anthropocentric. It's like there's our consciousness, and there's just the things that resemble it in various ways, but not necessarily in the same way. Whereas I think the way that I've been thinking about consciousness over the years, it's not like that. It's not like this anthropocentric thing. It's more like it's this deep natural property. And then there's this project of figuring out what it is, what its essential nature is, and so on. A bit like there's a project of figuring out what water is, or what lightning is. So yeah, you can use the concept of water just to refer to whatever is vaguely is watery in some way. Like, that's to use it in a very nominal or superficial way. And that's fine. You can just stipulate that that's how you're using the concept. And similarly with consciousness, I could just stipulate that I'm using it in this really superficial way.
So why can't we have both ways, though? I mean, so, you bring the tools of two-dimensional semantics in. So it's like, one is the primary intention, one's a secondary intention, to take Chalmers' way of talking about things. But
yeah, I'm actually okay with that. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So then what consciousness is for us, I mean, but the key move there is that whatever we pick out by it is for us, the important one. The rest are kind of not as important. So is there water on Twin Earth? Sure. Does that mean that water is not necessarily H2O? No, we're using different ways of picking it out in both those two cases. But it's still true that water is necessarily H2O because we're here, and that's what water picks out here.
So yeah, you can use it in that kind of natural kind of way, and then you pick out the thing that is plays the consciousness role in us.
Right. Yeah.
I tend to think that's how we're ordinarily thinking of consciousness, is the thing that plays that role in us.
And then once you do that, though, you can say, well, it's necessarily that's what it is.
Yeah. But then I'm going to argue that that's not what's important, and that also that's not the same thing as what you can access through imagination. So if you have a concept of consciousness as like having the thing that matters in the way that consciousness does, then I mean, I haven't made the case of this yet in our conversation, but I would argue that we should extend our moral concern beyond just the things that have the state that plays the consciousness role in us.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I like that. Go ahead. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh no, sorry. I keep sorry that I keep interrupting.
I was just going to say I like that part of your view. I think that's really an important and cool part of it. But anyway, go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah. I mean, so I don't know. One way you can think of my view is more like a sort of conceptual pluralism. So it's like we can distinguish these different concepts that are in the ballpark of what we ordinarily think of as phenomenal consciousness. And according to me, they're not a priori equivalent. And also, when we think it through, we can argue that they don't pick out exactly the same set of beings. And so I tend to think the concept that treats consciousness as a natural property or something like that is the one that we're ordinarily using. But in a way, if someone denied that, I don't have a huge beef with them. Because I still think that there's these different concepts that are not equivalent and pick out different things. And so in some way or other, we're going to have some kind of interesting revisionary picture.
Yeah. So is what you're saying then right now that even if you succeed in sort of somehow keeping the idea that we're in the center, right, so to speak, that I guess I know you have like these edgelings in the center and all that. I think that's interesting, but I think what we really want is just that we're typical, that the kind of, the basic aspects of our conscious experience are typical in some sense of conscious beings. Maybe that means we're in the center, maybe it doesn't, but so suppose you grant that. You're still saying though that there are these other states that are not like that, but that have the same kind of moral weight, and we should respect those creatures just as much as we respect so-called conscious creatures.
Yeah, well, there's two things there. There's the thing about the center, and there's the thing about the moral importance of consciousness. I mean, let me just say the thing about us being really stereotypical examples of conscious beings. I think if we have this kind of natural kind view of consciousness, then we're not guaranteed to be like super stereotypical. I think we can certainly say that we're not like extremely peripheral, like we're kind of borderline cases, because just then semantics won't work out properly. It'd be hard to explain how we're even referring to consciousness if we're right on the borderline. But nonetheless, if you are kind of realist about it in this natural kind of way, we might not be particularly stereotypical cases of conscious beings. So let me make that point.
Okay.
Whereas if you've got this view where what makes something conscious is just that it resembles us in some way, then that just guarantees that we're right in the middle. But I think you want to talk about the moral importance stuff, right?
Yeah,
let's do that. Okay, excellent. So I think a lot of people are going to think that their beliefs about the moral importance of consciousness are kind of bedrock. Like, they really care about being conscious. If they lost phenomenal consciousness, that would be to lose everything. If some being doesn't have it, then they just don't have moral status. They don't have a life that is important in the way that the life of a conscious being is, and so on. And I agree that these are very basic bedrock kind of moral principles that we seem to have. And so any project that tries to kind of argue that we can dig below that bedrock and revise them, admittedly, is on somewhat tendentious ground. So I'm just going to first of all say that. I don't think I've got like a really strong argument for a revision. But nonetheless, I do think that there's some ways of getting into this where you can sort of talk yourselves into a position where something's going to have to give, some kind of revision is going to have to happen, and a revision in the direction of granting moral status to non-conscious beings is not a crazy way of resolving that tension. So let me just say why I think there's a tension.
Yeah.
Well, let me give you, first of all, I like to use a lot of analogies here to get people's intuitions going. So one analogy is with, imagine fairly realistically, sorry, I'm losing my voice again. Imagine fairly realistically a bunch of people who think that the property of being a human being is super morally significant. Like, human beings matter and no one else matters. Then after a period of time, they discover some other beings that are really rather similar to human beings. So imagine, for example, there's actually some Neanderthals that still exist on planet Earth that have just been hiding away somewhere when we discover them. And you know, an intelligent member of this human worshipping group might think, oh my God, actually these Neanderthals are actually rather similar to human beings. And they might think that, they might realize that all along they had this kind of picture whereby metaphysically human beings are kind of on a pedestal. They're just totally different from other kinds of beings. And there's no chance that anything could be even vaguely similar to a human being. And that was part of what was driving their sort of faith in the moral supremacy of human beings. And then so when they discover that actually that metaphysical belief was wrong, and that you can have a thing that is really very similar to a human being, but it's not a human being, it seems like they'll kind of, yeah, that could produce a kind of crisis of faith in them, where they're like, okay, well, I really don't know what to think anymore. And one fairly reasonable way forward would be to extend the sphere of moral concern to the non-humans. But there are other ways forward too. They could just kind of dig their heels in and say, no, being a human is what matters, even though there are these other creatures that are very similar to humans. So I think they could do that too. I don't think there's like anything like rational consistency that would fall to one way or the other. I just think that a natural way to proceed in that circumstance would be to extend moral concern. And so similarly, that's how I'm thinking about consciousness. So take like, let's suppose that we've got like, I don't know, a certain fairly simple kind of fish or something. And we conclude that it's not actually phenomenally conscious, but it has a state that plays a similar role as pain. Okay. Let's imagine that we just granted knowledge of that somehow. Then the intuitive picture is that we have this thing that hurts and feels really bad. And what they have is just totally different metaphysically. It's just, if darkness within, yes, it's functionally the same, but it just lacks the thing that makes makes pain bad, like the hurtfulness. And it's because the thing it has is just so totally different in that way that it's reasonable to say that pain really matters and that what they have doesn't matter at all. I think that's our intuitive picture.
Right.
But here's the thing, like once you've got this kind of materialist worldview, and you agree with me that you get a clearer view on the nature of these things from the outside and not from the inside. So you take up the perspective of the zombie Martian scientist. Then you look at this fish and you look at us, and it's not really that different. It's just like they've got a thing that plays the pain role and we've got a thing that plays the pain role. And actually, metaphysically, they're really rather similar. And once you see that it really could be like that, even though they don't technically count as having pain in the sense that we use that word, they still have a thing that's pretty kind of like pain. I think that means that one of the things that, as it were, was propping up our belief in the supremacy and importance of consciousness is sort of kicked away a little bit. Right. So we're in a situation where I think one reasonable way to proceed once that's kicked away is to say, okay, well, let's extend our concern to these beings because of a thing that's a lot like pain, even though it's not pain. And yeah, it's puzzling because if you've got this like lights on, lights off kind of binary deep divide picture, you might think, well, how can it be like pain if the lights are not on? But then my response to that is to say, well, that lights on, lights off picture is kind of like misleading. You need to just forget that and just think of it all objectively, and then you'll really see what's going on.
I mean, so this part of your view, I think, is you don't need the other part of it to maintain it. So I'm wondering what you think about someone who might say, well, look, I think there is a lights on, lights off divide, but I also think that the argument for treating the fish morally is strong, even if they lack what we call pain, because they have something that plays the pain role. So damage is still bad to them in some sense. It's not phenomenally bad, but it's still bad. So I don't see where the conflict with you could still say, well, the lights are off, lights are on here, the light over there, but we still have good reason for expanding the sphere of moral consideration.
Well, I mean, if someone says that, then I'm like, great.
Oh, okay.
Right. But I was thinking kind of what's driving our willingness to sort of exclude the fish from moral concern was this idea that what they have is just totally different from what we have. And that because it lacks the internal light or something like that.
Right.
but then the thought is that, oh, actually, when you really see what's going on metaphysically from this external point of view, and you see that actually there's not that kind of deep difference between us and them, then that's a reason for thinking we should extend moral concern, much like the human Neanderthal sort of case. Like that.
Yeah, right. And so I that part of the Martian scientist, I think that part of the argument seems very forceful to me. I think that's a very strong argument, but I don't see why it has to come with this idea that there's no significance to consciousness. So would it be wrong? I guess it is wrong, but on your view, there's no ordering here, right? So that it's not like more wrong to harm a conscious creature than it is to harm an unconscious creature or something like that.
Oh, well, yeah, this gets into a different issue, which has to do with whether consciousness is graded.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, I think that it's reasonably likely that we'll discover that there is a fairly smooth gradient between shallow gradient between us and bacteria. I don't think we know that for sure. I think it could be that there's some very sudden phase change or something like that when you get to the conscious beings. But for all we know, it could be like a shallow gradient.
Yeah.
Us and them. It's a different impact on our moral thinking, I think. Yeah, my view is that if that's what we discover empirically, then we should be willing to talk about consciousness coming in degrees. It would be perfectly reasonable to revise our moral thinking to reflect that. So there could be something like degrees of importance corresponding to degrees of consciousness or something like that.
Okay, yeah, that's interesting. But even if it weren't degrees, what if there was a phase transition and you either get phenomenal consciousness or you don't, and the fish don't have it, but they have something that plays a role that's similar to what we call the pain role. So in that case, is it still more wrong to harm? Say you had two fish, one, like there's a trout and there's a bass, and the trout has phenomenal consciousness and the bass doesn't, or whatever the case may be. Then on your view, would it be more morally wrong to harm, I forget which one I said was the conscious one, but anyway, the one that has phenomenal consciousness, or are they still on a par morally?
Well, I mean, I don't have like a settled view about how exactly we should revise our ordinary thinking to accommodate these metaphysical discoveries. Yeah, on the face of it, though, if you just have these two really similar creatures that have interests in the same kind of way and just happen to have some fairly arbitrary difference in their design. So I don't mean design in a kind of intelligent design way, just in their stroke. Then yeah, on the face of it, it's hard to see how there could be some justification for saying that one of them matters more than the other. I think that's right.
So,
but I do think that a sort of plausible way to develop our moral thinking about other beings probably would take into account things like how smart they are, how much they have interests of the kind that we have, like they have a whole life that they care about and so on, rather than simple creatures that maybe don't quite have interests in quite the same way that we do. So I think all those things might matter morally.
Right. That's why I was thinking of two fish, but it sounds so if you had a trolley problem where you had, a zombie on one side and a typical human on the other side, there'd be no reason to pull the lever one way or the other on your view, it sounds like.
Sorry, just say the case again. So what do you have on?
If you had a trolley problem sort of case where you have one zombie on one side and a typical human on the other side, you could pull the lever to divert it towards one or the other. Say it was heading towards the human or heading towards the zombie or whatever, you could pull the lever and have it go the other way. There would be no reason to pull the lever on your view.
Yeah. I mean, it might depend on the details of what kind of zombie it is, but
yeah,
the mere fact that they're a zombie does not on its own automatically militate in favor of saving the human. Yes.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I guess I have the opposite. I mean, obviously I have a kind of more traditional view that it would be wrong to kill the zombie, but less wrong than killing the human.
Yeah, no, I'd say basically, yeah, my position is that that's a kind of I know this is going to be pretty hard to swallow. But my view is that that's a kind of arbitrary prejudice in favor of one specific way of as it were, realizing the consciousness role in us.
I mean, I find that so fascinating.
And if the zombie basically is like an intelligent being that has a rich mental life and cares about itself and cares about other beings and so on in the way that we do, it just happens to not have this fairly arbitrary feature that we have that we call consciousness, then I don't think that that means that they matter less than us.
That's interesting. So, but why think they have a rich mental life since they're stipulated to have no mental life? I mean, there's.
Well, I wouldn't agree with that characterization. I think that lacking the thing that we call consciousness does not mean that you lack a rich mental life, because they can have all sorts of cognitive states. They can have interests and desires and whims and dreams and so on. They can
dreams in this form of hopes. You mean, not like dreams?
Yeah. Well, they can even have like functional analogs of experiences that just don't have what we call experience.
Right. So, I mean, I agree with you that you shouldn't discount the zombie entirely, because I think that those states matter, and that, intelligence, rationality, and those sorts of things count for something, even if there's no consciousness involved at all. So I agree with that part. But I guess I just don't see the reason for thinking that the fact that I can suffer and it can't doesn't matter somehow to the moral calculation. Now, I get what you're saying, that in ultimate reality, there's a fairly arbitrary difference between me and the zombie metaphysically. So I have some physical state that they don't have, or some physical quality that they don't have, or something like that. So that seems fairly arbitrary from the point of view of like third person.
Yeah,
but it's not fairly arbitrary from the first person.
Yeah, but then my view is that that's misleading. That if you really want to see in the cold light of day what's actually out there, think of it from the outside. And what you're going to see is that just two different beings with two different realizations of a similar high-level architecture. And there's no deep asymmetry between them. And I think that is also an argument for extending concern to them. I mean, imagine things from their point of view, as it were. They're not conscious beings, but still, they might even have a concept of something like. They might even have a concept that's somewhat like our concept of consciousness. They might even have philosophers who go on about internal lights and so on.
Yeah.
From their point of view, they might be like, oh yeah, these poor humans, they lack the internal light of consciousness, or whatever it is that they have. And they might think, oh well, yeah, obviously that we should favor people from our race of beings in a trolley problem because they lack consciousness. They looked out from the outside, like their internal light intuition and our internal light intuition are just on a par. They're both equally right or both equally wrong. There's no asymmetry between us that could justify saying that one or other of us is better or worse in our thinking.
Right.
Is doing better or worse in our thinking.
So this is the hegemony of the third person.
And so that's just a way of saying that in a way there's just isn't this deep asymmetry between us. And so given that, I think it is reasonable to think, okay, well, maybe what they have matters as much as what we have.
Yeah, I mean, so this is the hegemony of the third person thing, right? This is it.
Yeah, that's
because
it's that combined with some sort of simple moral reasoning.
Right. Yeah. But I mean, but what I mean by that is you're not allowing first person data as part of the data set.
Yeah, well, that's right. I mean, it's not that I'm denying that we can know things about experience from a first person point of view. I think we can know a whole bunch of stuff about what experience is like and so on. But still, ultimately, if you have this kind of objective picture of things, then you know really in the cold light of day what's actually out there.
Yeah, so the cold light of day is very cold.
It's very cold. Yeah,
it's very cold.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, I would, to be honest with you, if more people thought through this and took this view seriously, the world would be a better place. So I think that this sort of stuff is important.
I mean, I think it have practical implications. If I mean, this is a little bit silly, but like if some aliens landed on planet Earth and tried to live amongst us, and we concluded that they lacked phenomenal consciousness, that might be hugely impractical, because then we might refuse to cooperate with them and treat them with respect and so on.
Right.
Whereas actually, I think we'd probably be better off treating them as conscious, as it were.
Yeah, I mean, you don't even need aliens. I mean, you just think about ants or bees or trees even. I'm not sure what your views about trees are, but plants are pretty cognitively sophisticated.
Yeah.
It's not unclear that they don't have something which at least would satisfy some of these constraints that you were talking about. In the ball, they probably are edgelings in some sense in that sense of the term that we were talking about earlier. But they're very, very, I mean, they can do classical conditioning and so forth, and they exchange information, they favor their young. So it seems like there's an argument for extending even, some sort of conscious like property even to plants here. Do you agree with that, or is that too far on your view?
No, I'm not. I mean, I don't actually have that view necessarily as a sort of settled position, but I'm somewhat sympathetic with a view where like all life matters or something like that.
Uh-huh.
I'd be a little bit inclined to say there that that would be an example of a type of view where, maybe a plant doesn't have the inner light in the sense that you could accurately represent its internal state through imaginative projection or something. Maybe it's just too different from a human being to, so as it were, kind of be able to, in any sense, accurately simulate its internal state with your internal state.
Right.
But nonetheless, maybe it matters in the way that maybe, you could have a view on which it nonetheless matters in the way that a conscious being does. But that would be to hold a view on which, as it were, the things that have the internal light, in the sense that you can imagine their point of view, and the things that matter morally in the way that conscious beings do, come apart. And you might say that's not surprising because the inner light thing is really anthropocentric. The inner light thing is just the things that resemble us enough that we can simulate them. But why think that what actually ultimately matters is just resembling us in some way? We're like just one arbitrary creature. Maybe all life is what matters or something. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's not even clear to me that they aren't similar enough to imaginatively simulate their states. I mean,
okay.
At least at some level, they need nutrients. They're on the sun. They're searching for things underground, spreading their roots. I mean, there's a certain basic level of need, biological need, probably that you can put yourself into.
Yeah.
I mean, if you can do it with a Martian that lacks consciousness, I'm not sure why I can't do it with the tree. I mean,
I'm not completely closed off to that idea. Yeah, I mean, they're trying to achieve homeostasis and they're regulating themselves in all these ways that are very complex and maybe involve some kind of even primitive forms of information processing.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. But I mean, if I try and imagine, if I try to imagine a plant having like perceptual experience, I just think I might be going astray though.
Right.
Because they don't have any kind of, well, I don't know this for sure, but I doubt that they have any kind of centralized, integrated informational states in the way that we do, which would be the kind of thing that you'd be simulating if you imagine them seeing or something like that.
Right. Yeah, no, I don't think you can. It might be similar to worms. Worms have light sensitivity, but probably not visual experiences, etc.
I mean, one interesting idea in this ballpark is maybe we could like get the skill of simulating things that can't initially simulate just by knowing more about their internal functioning, and kind of maybe there's some way in which you could practice there could be some kind of imaginative practice where you could kind of get closer to being in an internal state that is similar to that one, so that you can emulate them in the way that you couldn't before. Why not?
Yeah, exactly. So, and another thing that like this, so this kind of brings, I wonder what your view about uploading and those kinds of thought experiments that people talk about with respect to uploading consciousness to a simulation. It seems like on your type of view, one of the worries that people has of like, for me, I'm a kind of biological guy. So I feel like if I uploaded into a digital environment, I'd lose consciousness. But on your view, it shouldn't matter.
Yeah, that's exactly it. So like, in a way, it's kind of a red herring.
Right.
Even if you don't technically have the thing that we call consciousness when you upload, you can have something that's just as good.
So if you knew that if you uploaded, you would lose consciousness, you'd still do it?
Yeah, that's part of my view. Yeah. I mean, for people listening to this who are familiar with Derek Parfit's views about the self and personal identity, my view is very similar to that. It's kind of, it's really just explicitly modeled on what he said about the self and personal identity. So
yeah, it's like you read that passage where he says you can't do this for consciousness. And you're like, oh yeah, you can.
He warns against people like me. but,
like challenge accepted.
I'll just going there anyway. Yeah, so yeah, he thinks that if you look at something like teletransportation, even if it kills you, you should just do it anyway because you have something as good as continuing to exist.
Yeah.
In that case, so I basically think what my view of uploading or the other kinds of zombification type scenarios is similar. So even if it doesn't have this thing that we thought was important, it can have something that is similar enough that it can be a good surrogate.
Yeah. So I mean, is this an empirical question on your view? So is it possible that you could upload, like let's suppose you could go in and out, you upload, you come back out, and you're like, holy hell, that was terrible.
Well, it's an empirical question to what extent something like uploading is technologically possible.
Well, that it would matter that you would lose something that you'd have something just as good.
Yeah, if it really does emulate the brain, like right down to the level of like individual neural firings and so on, it's a bit hard to see how it couldn't be just good, because it would be functionally the same right to the finest.
Right, but so it's not conceivable on your view that you could upload, then come out of the virtual world and recognize that, wow, while I was in there, it was terrible. It's much better to be conscious. That's not something that could happen on your view?
Well, I mean, if you are functioning exactly like you would with your ordinary biological brain, right down to the level of individual neural firings, then there's no possibility of, like, at least introspectively, you picking up on some important difference. I mean, it depends on the uploading scenario. If you're like in some virtual world where you're, the virtual environment itself is bad in ways that the real environment is not, then of course that would be bad. But that wouldn't have anything to do with the uploading part. It would just have to do with being in the very in a different environment.
Yeah, exactly. But so, yeah, because I get what you're saying. So you're in the virtual world, you're lacking consciousness, you have all the same rational functional capacities. So you kind of introspect and you're saying, well, gee, I'm tasting chocolate and there's a sunset over there. But it's possible that then you came out of the virtual world and suddenly realized the lights came back on, like the way in which you suddenly realized that the refrigerator stopped humming a second ago. You'd be like, oh, whoa. I didn't realize it when I was in there, but now I realize there was something that I was missing in there. That's not a possibility.
If it's part of the setup that you really are just functionally the same at a very deep level, in the upload scenario and the real scenario, then I think that just rolls out something like that, where you realize that you're in a completely different kind of state. I mean,
once you come out.
Yeah, but how would you notice it? I mean, you'd have to have some way of remembering what it was like, and then having some way of accessing the alleged difference across time or something like that. But if you set it up so that you just keep functioning in exactly the same way over time, then that seems to automatically rule out that kind of realization. So realization in the sense of suddenly coming to see that you were in this other state.
Right.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Right? Sorry, maybe I'm just confused about the scenario that you're describing, but that's how it looks.
No, I think you got it right. Yeah. No, it's it just seems like there'd be some. So I get what you're saying. You couldn't notice it in a cognitive way because all of that stuff is being simulated.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, no, maybe it's incoherent what I'm thinking. But it just, I guess I had the intuition that there would be some sense in which there would be a difference. I mean, obviously there would be a difference because in one case you're experiencing the taste of chocolate, in the other case you're pseudo experiencing it or something like that. But it's not a difference that you could latch onto.
Right.
Still seems like it would make a difference. I'm stuck in this way of thinking where it's like I'd rather be conscious. I mean,
yeah, no, that's understandable. I think like 99.99% of people are going to disagree with me.
Yeah, but for not good reasons. It sounds, I mean, I see once you go with the third person route, then the argument's very secure. It's just the question of whether you allow that first move, I think, where you admit that the immersion scientist really has as good an understanding of the state as once you allow that, it's downhill from there.
Okay, well, I'm glad you're conceding at least that much, if not the first part.
I mean, I'm probably sounding more skeptical than I actually am, because I'm just trying to understand the view. But I mean, I actually think that it's very interesting. It's a rich view, and the best philosophical views are the challenging ones. I mean, so it's really cool to have someone who's seriously thinking through these issues in a very careful way, like you are. So I'm not. I probably am. I'm not trying to trash the view at all. I think it's actually.
No, I'm not. Yeah, no, I'm not hearing that at all. Actually, I feel like
I'm getting good.
Pretty sympathetic. Hearing from you, so thanks.
Yeah, well, I definitely enjoyed it. So I'm noticing we're getting on in time. I hear my children have woken up and are giving their mother a hard time. So, but I wonder if there's anything that you were hoping would come up that hasn't come up in this discussion.
I mean, there's a lot more we could have talked about, but that actually covered some pretty big bases in my way of thinking. So that was pretty good.
Okay. So like what could have come up that didn't?
What did we not talk about?
I guess microskepticism was one thing that I thought was really cool. Discussion of reductionism and stuff.
Talk about the metaphysics, like reductive materialism and non-reductive materialism. I mean, there's also a lot. I've thought a lot about the measurement of experience, how to think about individuation of phenomenal properties. That kind of those types of issues. There's a lot of that in my book manuscript as well. We didn't get into any of that, but you know, in some ways that's more details. Some of the really sort of big background issues we've hit pretty well.
Yeah, chapter 8 is the measurement chapter. There's a lot in there.
Yeah, I kind of like took a deep dive into the old literature on psychophysical scaling, and I thought a lot about just these techniques for eliciting judgments about the similarity relationships between experiences and making inferences from that to like the real structure of the phenomenology. So I think there's a lot of fascinating work that happened in the past on that that's been maybe neglected by the philosophers, or actually these days by the cognitive scientists too, it seems.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so I think there's a lot of value of going back and just like having another look at some of those old discussions and seeing what some of the foundational issues there that people are talking about. And I think that's very interesting. So I've tried to sort of dig some of that stuff up as part of the book, partly just going on a mission to sort of get people to pay more attention to that.
Yeah, I think it works. And it's also crucial to your argument overall, because one of the ways that you want to positively argue for materialism by suggesting that there's, structural spaces that we can find and then find material things which kind of map onto them. I mean, that's part of your three-pronged defense of why, how it is that we're going to defang these ideas that something can't be physical in this way.
Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah. So part of it is just one prong of that is this sort of idea of structural matching. And the project there is that, you have to somehow measure the structure of experience and then figure out what's there in the brain that has the same structure. And it was also relevant to this idea of hidden nature, because I don't think that subjects can just immediately, infallibly access the structure of their experience. We have to use empirical methods to kind of probe what that structure really is.
Right.
And so, so it's important in along various dimensions.
So, I mean, I guess, I do have to sort of wrap this up, but I do wonder, like, just really quickly, because there are people like Adam Pouts who does, very careful work about this stuff too. And he's interested in the structure of experience, but he kind of comes up with the opposite view, right? So he uses it to argue against naive realism. There's nothing out there that matches this structure. It's internal states that match the structure. But then he's not a materialist, or doesn't, he sees the structure matching, but doesn't think that that's a reason for accepting physicalist reduction. So what do you think tips us one way versus the other here?
So there's like one half of his way of arguing that I'm very sympathetic with, where he argues for internalism based on these structural considerations. So basically the idea is we have access to the structure of experience. If you look in the material world, you find states with the right structure inside the brain, but outside the brain, like with a stimulus or something, you don't have the right structure. And so that's an argument that it's really all internally determined. So that much I'm very sympathetic with. at least, you know, schematically. And then, but the other part of his case is less to do with the structural stuff and is more to do with, this actually relates to what we were talking about right at the beginning, so maybe this is a good way to wrap things up. So like, he thinks that it's just intuitively obvious. Well, no, he also has theoretical arguments for this, that experience has this relational structure. It's like, if I'm experiencing greenness, then fundamentally in the metaphysics, there has to be something like awareness of greenness or acquaintance of greenness or something like that, a special kind of intentional relation to a qualitative property. And his case against materialism and reductionism basically is that there's just nothing like that in the brain, even though internalism is true. So therefore we should be non-reductive. So my response basically is going to be that when you think it through in the long run, that intuition that experience is relational and also the theoretical arguments for it are not going to hold weight, but we could have a kind of non-relational view where it's just a brain state that does enough justice to the kind of considerations that he gives for being a relationist. In fact, does as much justice as you can do to them, but without actually conceding that it really is relational. It's going to be like, you know, it seems relational to us and we talk about it as if it's relational and so on, but really something non-relational can play a kind of role that we can be satisfied with rejecting the kind of metaphysics that he has. Roughly speaking, that's what I'm going to say. So it's kind of like, let's debunk. It's debunk and deflate. That's the overall strategy. Someone comes along with a feature that turns out to be incompatible with. I'm now thumping the desk. You can see my. Someone comes up with some feature like that, and they say that blocks reduction. Then we need to like see whether they really can justify believing in that really strong inflationary way that blocked materialism. And I think typically they can't justify the more inflationary reading of their data. And if we give it a thinner, more deflationary reading, then it's not incompatible with materialism after all. So I think time and again, I think that's the kind of argumentative structure you're going to have there.
Debunk and deflate.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, on that note, then let's go ahead and call this a day. I've kept you a little bit over already, so I apologize for that.
Oh, no problem.
But just thanks again for taking the time. I really enjoyed reading your work and thinking through this issue. So really appreciate it.
Yeah, this was great. Thank you so much. Really, really appreciate it.
Okay, so just hang on for a second. I'll say bye off air. All right, we're